At 6:15 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Second Lieutenant Charles Counds climbed into the cockpit of his Brewster F-2, a Buffalo at Midway Atoll, and knew he was about to fly an aircraft that would probably get him killed. The Buffalo was obsolete, everyone knew it. The Marines who flew it called it the flying coffin. The aircraft was overweight, underpowered, and completely outmatched by the Japanese fighters it would face in approximately 40 minutes. Kun was 22 years old. He had been at Midway for 3 weeks. This would be his first combat mission. Radar had just detected a massive Japanese air raid heading toward the island 93 mi out and closing fast. 36 Zeros escorted the bombers. The Zero was faster, more agile, could turn tighter, and could outclimb the Buffalo in every measurable way. American doctrine said to never dogfight with a Zero. Use your aircraft's advantages. Hit and run. Avoid turning engagements. The problem was that the Buffalo had no advantages. It was slower than the Zero. At altitude, it was less maneuverable than the Zero in turns. Its only benefit was slightly heavier armor, but that armor made it even slower and less responsive. The Marines at Midway had 21 Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F-4F Wildcats. The Wildcats were marginally better, but not by much. Most pilots got assigned to the Buffaloes. Kun was one of them. 26 fighters took off that morning. 14 pilots would not come back. The Buffalo was never supposed to be this bad. When it first flew in December 1937, it represented a significant advancement for the United States Navy. It was the Navy's first monoplane fighter with retractable landing gear, replacing obsolete biplanes. In 1938, the prototype exceeded 300 mph and demonstrated decent handling characteristics. The Navy ordered 54 aircraft. Production began in 1939. Then the problem started. The production version, designated F-2A1, gained weight during development. The Navy wanted more fuel capacity, more ammunition, heavier guns, armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Every addition made sense individually. Collectively, they destroyed the aircraft's performance. The F-2A2 added even more weight with additional equipment. By the time the F-2A3 entered service in 1941, the aircraft was carrying 1,300 lb more than the original prototype. The engine remained the same, a WRII R1820 Cyclone producing 00 horsepower. That engine could barely handle the original lightweight design. With the added weight, the Buffalo became dangerously underpowered. Maximum speed dropped to 310 mph. Rate of climb fell to 2,000 ft per minute. The aircraft felt sluggish and unresponsive. Pilots reported that the controls were heavy and that the Palm Buffalo wallowed through maneuvers like it was moving through water. Wing loading increased dramatically. The small wings could not efficiently support the heavier airframe. This created high stall speeds and poor low-speed handling. Exactly the characteristics you did not want in a fighter that needed to dogfight. The landing gear was weak. Hard landings frequently damaged the undercarriage, bending struts and collapsing wheels. Maintenance crews spent hours repairing landing gear that should have been stronger from the start. The worst part was that everyone knew about these problems months before Midway. The first combat use of the F-2A Buffalo came in early 1942 in Southeast Asia. Royal Air Force squadrons in Malaya and Singapore flew Buffalo against Japanese fighters during the Japanese invasion. The results were catastrophic. Japanese Zeros and Ki-43 Oscars massacred the Buffaloes. British pilots reported that the Buffalo could not keep up with Japanese fighters in speed, climb, or maneuverability. When British pilots tried to dogfight, they died. When they tried to dive away, the Japanese caught them. There was no tactic that worked. Dutch pilots in the Netherlands East Indies experienced the same nightmare. They flew B-339 export versions of the Buffalo, slightly lighter than the American F-2A3. Even with reduced weight, the aircraft was no match for Japanese fighters. The Dutch lost most of their Buffaloes within the first 3 months of combat. Several Dutch pilots described the Buffalo as a death trap. Despite these warnings from the Pacific Theater, the United States Marine Corps continued using Buffaloes at Midway. The reason was simple. There was nothing else available. Better fighters existed, but they were assigned to aircraft carriers or to squadrons in Hawaii. Midway got the leftovers. Marine Fighting Squadron 221, commanded by Major Floyd Parks, received a mixed group of 21 Buffaloes and 7 Wildcats in late 1941. The squadron trained with these aircraft. For months, pilots learned the Buffalo's limitations, its poor climb rate, its sluggish roll response, its tendency to wallow in turns. They developed tactics to compensate, but tactics only worked if you had an aircraft capable of executing them. The Buffalo was not that aircraft. Major F.L. Lloyd Parks knew his squadron was equipped with obsolete fighters. He was 34 years old, an experienced pilot who had been flying since 1931. He had watched the reports coming out of Asia. He knew what happened to Buffalo pilots who engaged Zeros. On the morning of June 4th, Parks briefed his pilots before the scramble. He emphasized the importance of altitude advantage, maintaining formation discipline, and avoiding prolonged engagements. His instructions were sound. They just could not overcome the fundamental inadequacy of the Buffalo. When radar detected the Japanese raid at 5:55 in the morning, Parks ordered an immediate launch. His squadron scrambled within minutes. 26 fighters climbed toward 30,000 FT, racing to gain altitude before the Japanese arrived. Parks organized his aircraft into 5 divisions. 4 divisions flew Buffaloes. 1 division flew Wildcats. At approximately 6:40 in the morning, Parks spotted the Japanese formation 30 mi northwest of Midway. Over 100 Japanese aircraft, bombers escorted by 36 Zeros, flying in tight formation at 14,000 FT. Parks had altitude advantage. His fighters were at 15,000 ft, positioned between the Japanese and Midway. He ordered the attack. The 1st Division, led by Parks himself, dove toward the Japanese bombers. 5 Buffaloes against over 100 enemy aircraft. They got one pass before the Zeros reacted. Parks fired at a bomber, saw his tracers strike the fuselage, then had to break off as 3 Zeros dove on his tail. He tried to dive away. The Zeros followed easily, closing the distance. Parks pulled into a hard turn, trying to force an overshoot. The Buffalo responded slowly, wallowing. Through the maneuver, the Zeros stayed with him, firing continuously. Parks' Buffalo took multiple hits. 20 cannon shells tore through the right wing and fuselage. The engine began smoking. Parks tried to dive toward Midway, hoping to crash land on the island. He never made it. His Buffalo broke apart at 5,000 ft. The wing structure failing under combat damage and the stress of high-speed maneuvering. Parks died instantly. His entire division was wiped out within 7 minutes. Second Lieutenant Charles Kunn was flying in the 3rd Division. 4 Buffaloes tasked with engaging the fighter escort. Cowan saw Parks's division get massacred. He watched Buffaloes burning and falling toward the ocean. Then the Zeros turned toward his division. Kunn had approximately 15 seconds to decide what to do. American doctrine said to maintain speed, use altitude. Do not get caught in a turning fight. But the Zeros were already turning toward him at his altitude, and his Buffalo could not outrun them in level flight. He had no good options. He rolled into a defensive turn, trying to force the Zeros to overshoot. The Buffalo's controls felt like they were frozen. He pulled back on the stick. The nose came up slowly, too slowly. A Zero snapped around inside his turn, got on his tail and opened fire. Kunn saw tracer rounds streaming past his canopy. He felt impacts along the fuselage, heard the distinctive crack of cannon shells hitting metal. He tried to roll out and dive, but the Buffalo was not responding fast enough. More hits. The instrument panel exploded. The engine seized. The aircraft began vibrating violently. Kunn knew he was going down. He managed to keep the Buffalo level long enough to gain some air speed, then ditched in the ocean 3 mi from Midway. He survived. His aircraft sank within 2 minutes. Of the 26 Marine fighters that took off that morning, 17 were shot down. 14 of those were Buffaloes. Marine Fighting Squadron 221 effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. The Japanese lost 5 fighters. The kill ratio was catastrophic for every Marine fighter that shot down a Zero. More than 3 Marine aircraft were destroyed. The Buffaloes accounted for most of the losses. Pilots who survived described the same experience. The aircraft was too slow to escape, too unresponsive to dogfight, too poorly armed to achieve kills quickly. Several pilots managed to damage Japanese aircraft but could not finish them off because the Buffalo could not keep up during pursuit. The few Marine pilots who scored kills did so at close range, often sustaining damage in the process. Captain Marion Carl, flying a Wildcat, shot down 2 Japanese aircraft, but described the engagement as desperate and chaotic. He stated that the Wildcats were barely adequate and the Buffaloes were significantly worse. After the battle, the surviving Marines at Midway refused to fly Buffaloes in combat again. The squadron was re-equipped with Wildcats within weeks. Every remaining Buffalo at Midway was grounded, stripped for parts, or used as ground targets for gunnery practice. The aircraft's operational career in the United States military effectively ended at Midway. It had lasted less than 6 months, but the Buffalo was not the only pathetically inadequate fighter aircraft that flew during World War II. Other nations produced fighters that were equally disastrous aircraft that killed their own pilots faster than they killed the enemy. Germany, despite producing some of the war's most effective fighters, also created one of its worst. The Mesmet Me-210 was supposed to replace the Bluff 110 heavy fighter, but instead, it nearly destroyed Messed's reputation and forced the Luftwaffe to continue using outdated aircraft for years. The Me-210's development began in 1937, before the Bf-110 had even entered full production. Mesmet engineers wanted to create a superior multi-role aircraft, capable of serving as a heavy fighter, reconnaissance plane, and fast bomber. On paper, the design looked promising. The Me-210 featured 2 Daimler-Benz DB6-01 engines producing 1150 horsepower each. It had a more streamlined fuselage than the Bf-110, better visibility for the crew, and defensive armament in remote-controlled gun turrets. The Reich Air Ministry was so impressed that they ordered 1,000 aircraft in mid-1940. Before the prototype had even flown, this decision would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. The first prototype M210V1 made its maiden flight on September 2, 1939. The test pilot immediately noticed severe handling problems. The aircraft suffered from extreme longitudinal and directional instability. It oscillated constantly during flight, snaking left and right without pilot input. In turns, the instability became dangerous. The aircraft would snap into unexpected attitudes, making precise maneuvering impossible. Engineers tried multiple fixes. They replaced the twin-tail design with a single large vertical stabilizer. This had almost no effect. The aircraft continued to oscillate. They added automatic leading-edge slats to improve stall characteristics. This made things worse. With the nose up or in a turn, the slats would open and the Me-210 would whip into violent spins. The second prototype, Me-210V2, crashed during flutter testing in September 1940. The pilot barely managed to bail out before the aircraft broke apart. He described the spin as unrovable once it started. The chief test pilot for Mesed stated that the M210 had all the least desirable attributes an airplane could possess. Despite these catastrophic problems, production continued. The Reich Air Ministry was desperate to replace the Bf-110, which had proven vulnerable to British fighters during the Battle of Britain. They pressured Messud to fix the Me-210 quickly and get it into service. 16 prototypes and 94 pre-production aircraft were built in an attempt to resolve the design flaws. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem was the aircraft's aerodynamics. The wing design created inadequate directional stability. The fuselage was too short relative to the tail surfaces. The center of gravity was poorly positioned. These were not minor issues that could be fixed with adjustments. They required a complete redesign. Messerschmitt knew this. The Reich Air Ministry refused to accept it. Full production began in early 1941. Deliveries to frontline units started in April 1942. Pilots hated the aircraft immediately. Oberleutnant Verrer Streib, a night fighter pilot with significant combat experience, flew the Me-210 for evaluation and reported that it was unsuitable for combat operations. The instability made it impossible to use as a steady gun platform. In dog fights, the aircraft's unpredictable handling endangered the pilot more than it endangered the enemy. Landing was particularly hazardous. The M210 had weak landing gear that frequently collapsed on touchdown. Combined with the aircraft's unstable flight characteristics, landing accidents were common. Several pilots were killed or seriously injured during routine landings, not in combat. By April 1942, after approximately 90 Me-210s had been delivered, the Luftwaffe made an extraordinary decision. They canceled production. They ordered all Me-210 deliveries stopped immediately. They restarted production of the Bf-110, an aircraft they had planned to retire, because it was better than the Me-210 despite being several years older. 3 120 partially completed Mi-210s were placed in storage. The Luftwaffe refused to accept them. Messerschmitt attempted to salvage the program by developing an improved version, the Me-410, with a lengthened fuselage and more powerful engines. The Me-410 addressed some of the Me-210's problems and eventually saw limited service, but it never fully overcame the reputation damage caused by the Me-210 disaster. The M210 represented a complete failure of the German aircraft development process. An aircraft was ordered in massive quantities before testing was complete. Obvious design flaws were ignored in favor of maintaining production schedules. Pilots were forced to fly in aircraft that was more likely to kill them through mechanical failure than enemy action. The entire program wasted resources, delayed development of better aircraft, and damaged pilot confidence in Mess's designs. Italy produced an more spectacular failure. The Bradbar 88 Linz was an aircraft so pathetically inadequate that it could barely take off with a combat load, and when it did manage to get airborne, it could not maintain altitude or keep formation with other aircraft. The Bar 88 began development in 1936 as a multi-role aircraft capable of serving as a heavy fighter, reconnaissance plane, and ground attack aircraft. The design looked impressively modern. It featured a sleek all-metal fuselage, retractable landing gear, and twin Pop-1 radial engines producing 1,000 horsepower each. The prototype first flew in October 1936 and immediately impressed observers. It was fast, reaching speeds over 300 mph. In April 1937, Italian test pilot Furio Niccolò set two world speed over distance records in the Bar 88 prototype, averaging 321 mph, over 100 km, and 295 mph, over 1,000 km. Fascist propaganda celebrated the aircraft as proof of Italian engineering superiority. The Italian Air Ministry ordered the Bar 88 into production. Then reality destroyed the illusion. The production aircraft were heavier than the prototype by over 2,000 lb. Military equipment, armor, weapons, ammunition, radios, and operational systems added weight that the prototype never carried. The engines remained the same. Performance collapsed. The production Bar 88 could barely reach 200 mph. Climb rate was abysmal. The aircraft struggled to reach 10,000 ft with a full combat load. Wing loading increased dramatically, making the aircraft unstable and difficult to control. The most significant problem was that the Bar 88 was fundamentally over-engineered. The designers used both a traditional steel tube internal structure and a stressed skin outer covering, essentially building two airframes and combining them. This provided enormous structural strength, but added massive unnecessary weight. The aircraft could withstand stresses far beyond what combat operations required, but it was too heavy to fly effectively. Italian Air Force test pilots reported these problems during evaluation trials in 1939. They recommended canceling production. The Italian government ignored the recommendation. Political considerations outweighed operational reality. Canceling the Bar 88 would mean closing production lines and admitting that fascist propaganda had exaggerated Italian technological capabilities. Production continued. 81 aircraft were built by Brada and 24 by IMA. When Italy entered World War II in June 1940, several squadrons were equipped with Bar 88s. The 7th Gruppo Autonomo was assigned to the type for operations in North Africa. The aircraft's operational debut came on June 16, 1940 during Italian attacks on French airfields in Corsica. 12 Bar 88s participated in the raid. The lack of French opposition allowed the Italian aircraft to complete their missions without losses, but crews reported that the Bar 88s were extremely underpowered and handled poorly. These problems were about to get much worse. In August 1940, the 7th Gruppo moved to Libya to fight British forces operating in North African desert conditions required modifications to the aircraft. Sand filters were installed on the engines to prevent dust ingestion. These filters restricted air flow, reducing engine power output by approximately 30%. The already underpowered Bar 88 became almost unflyable. On September 14, 1940, the 7th Grouper was ordered to attack the British airfield at City Alani, approximately 250 km behind the front lines. 3 Bar 88s were assigned to the mission. Each aircraft carried 250 kg of bombs, full ammunition loads, and full fuel tanks. The attack never happened. The first Bar 88 attempted to take off and could not gain enough speed. The pilot aborted the takeoff before reaching the end of the runway. The second Bar 88 managed to get airborne but immediately began losing altitude. The pilot could not maintain level flight. He circled back to the airfield and landed, aborting the mission. The third Bar 88, piloted by the unit commander, took off successfully, but could not climb above 500 m. He flew toward the target but continued losing altitude slowly. Realizing he would never reach El Barani, he jettisoned his bombs over empty desert and returned to base, flying barely above ground level. The mission was a complete failure. None of the 3 aircraft reached the target. None dropped bombs on the enemy. One could not even take off. Italian commanders were horrified. An NDA to the 22 aircraft that could not complete basic missions was worse than useless. It consumed fuel, required maintenance, tied up pilots and ground crews, and provided zero combat capability. Desperate attempts were made to improve performance. The rear gunner and rear gun were removed to save weight. Internal equipment was stripped out. Bomb loads were reduced to 100 kg. Fuel was reduced to half tanks. None of these measures made significant difference. The Bar 88 remained fundamentally incapable of performing its mission. By mid-November 1940, only 5 months after Italy entered the war, the remaining Bar 88s in North Africa were grounded. They were stripped of all useful equipment. Weapons were removed. Radios were salvaged, and the empty airframes were scattered around Italian airfields as decoys. British reconnaissance aircraft would photograph these decoys and report them as operational Italian fighters, wasting British intelligence resources trying to track aircraft that could not fly. This was the most useful role the Bar 88 ever performed, serving as a stationary target to confuse the enemy. The degradation was complete. An aircraft that had set world speed records in 1937 was now being used as an immobile decoy in 1940. The WWII Aeronautica was forced to continue using completely obsolete aircraft like the Brada 65 and Fiat CR-32 biplanes because the modern Bar 88 was worse than aircraft designed 10 years earlier. Additional Bar 88s continued to be delivered throughout 1940 and 1941. Most went directly from the factory to scrapy yards. Usable components were salvaged and the airframes were destroyed. Approximately 150 Bar 88s were built. Almost none saw combat after. September 1940. The aircraft represented perhaps the most complete failure of any world war. II combat aircraft. It looked modern, set impressive records as a lightweight prototype, and was completely useless once military equipment was installed. These three aircraft, the Brewster Buffalo, Messerschmitt Me 210, and Bredebar 88, shared common characteristics that made them pathetically inadequate. All three looked promising during initial development. All three suffered from weight increases that destroyed performance. All three entered service despite warnings from test pilots. All three killed or endangered their own pilots more effectively than they harmed the enemy. The human cost of flying. Inadequate aircraft was enormous. At Midway, 14 Buffalo pilots died in a single morning because their aircraft could not compete with Japanese fighters. Major Floyd Parks, an experienced squadron commander, was killed because his Buffalo could not execute the maneuvers needed to survive combat. Second Lieutenant Charles Kuhn survived only because he ditched close enough to Midway that rescue boats could reach him before he drowned. German pilots flying the Me 210 faced similar dangers. The aircraft's instability killed pilots during routine training flights. Oberleutnant Hans Joachim Jabs, a successful night fighter pilot, refused to fly the Mi 210 operationally after evaluating it, stating that he would rather fly an obsolete Bf 110 than risk his life in an aircraft that could kill him without enemy intervention. Italian pilots in North Africa watched their Bar 88s fail to take off and realized they were flying death traps. Several Italian pilots requested transfers to units flying older but functional aircraft. They preferred to fly obsolete biplanes that could at least get airborne and maneuver. The psychological impact on pilots was devastating. Combat pilots accepted risk. They understood that flying against the enemy meant facing death. What they could not accept was dying because their own aircraft was inadequate. Pilots flying Buffaloes at Midway knew before takeoff that their aircraft was inferior to what they would face. They flew anyway because orders demanded it, but the knowledge that they were outmatched from the start eroded morale and confidence. Survivors of the Midway battle described feeling helpless. During the engagement, they did everything their training taught them, followed proper tactics, made correct decisions, and still got shot down because their aircraft simply could not perform. Captain Marion Carl, one of the few Marines who survived and scored kills at Midway, stated in later interviews that the Buffalo pilots were not killed because of pilot error or poor tactics. They were killed because they were sent into combat with inferior equipment. The responsibility for those deaths lay with the decision makers who continued fielding inadequate aircraft. Despite clear evidence of their deficiencies, similar frustrations affected German pilots flying the Me 210. They were promised an advanced fighter that would dominate the battlefield. Instead, they received an unstable aircraft that fought them as much as it fought the enemy. The reputation damage to Messid was significant. Pilots who had trusted Messed designs after flying the excellent BF-109 became skeptical of new Messmet aircraft. When the Me-410 was introduced, many pilots refused to fly it initially, assuming it would have the same problems as the Me-210. Restoring confidence required months of demonstration flights and successful combat operations. Italian pilots faced the worst situation. The Bar 88 failure exposed deeper problems in Italian military procurement and industrial capability. Pilots began questioning whether any Italian-designed aircraft could be trusted. The skepticism undermined confidence across the entire Regia Aeronautica and contributed to poor morale throughout the Italian Air Force. The institutional failures that produced these pathetic aircraft revealed systemic problems in how military aviation developed during the war. In every case, political and bureaucratic pressures overrode technical reality. The United States Navy knew the Buffalo was obsolete by early 1942, but continued deploying it because better alternatives were not available in sufficient numbers, and scrapping the Buffalo would mean admitting the procurement process had failed. German officials ordered 1,000 Me-210s before the prototype flew because they were desperate for a BF-110 replacement and assumed engineering problems could be fixed during production. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Italian fascist leadership demanded that the Bar 88 enter production despite test pilot warnings because canceling the program would be politically embarrassing. These decisions were made by people far from the combat zones, officials who would never fly the inadequate aircraft they approved. The consequences of their decisions fell on young pilots, men in their early 20s who climbed into cockpits knowing their aircraft was inferior and might kill them. Second Lieutenant Charles Kunn was 22 when he flew his Buffalo at Midway. He had been flying for less than a year. Major Floyd Parks was 34, experienced and skilled. Both flew the same inadequate aircraft. Experience could not compensate for an aircraft that was fundamentally outmatched. Parks died and Kunn barely survived, not because of differing skill levels, but because luck determined which pilot the Zeros targeted first. The engineering lessons from these failures were learned slowly and at terrible cost. The Buffalo demonstrated that adding weight to an airframe without increasing engine power destroys performance. The Navy's procurement process allowed incremental additions of equipment without comprehensive analysis of cumulative effects. Armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavier guns, and radio equipment were each justified. Individually, collectively, they destroyed the aircraft's performance. Post-war analysis identified multiple decision points where production should have been halted. At each point, bureaucratic momentum and reluctance to admit failure kept production moving forward. The Me-210 showed that aerodynamic stability cannot be fixed with minor adjustments once the basic design is flawed. After the second prototype crashed in September 1940, Engineers submitted reports stating the aircraft required fundamental redesign. They proposed lengthening the fuselage and completely redesigning tail surfaces. WWII ministry officials rejected these proposals because implementing them would delay production. Instead, officials ordered Messed to find solutions that did not require major structural changes. 16 prototypes and 94 pre-production aircraft were built in a desperate attempt to fix unfixable problems. The Luftwaffe eventually paid for this institutional failure with pilot lives and wasted resources. The WWII revealed that building an aircraft that is structurally overdesigned creates an aircraft that is too heavy to fly effectively. Italian engineers built an airframe strong enough to withstand forces far beyond combat requirements. The WWII could have survived a dive at terminal velocity and pulled out without structural failure. This capability was useless because the aircraft could not reach altitude in the first place and could barely accelerate to high speeds. The over-engineering stemmed from conservative design philosophy and lack of understanding about stressed skin. Construction. Italian engineers in the 1930s were transitioning from fabric-covered steel tube airframes to all metal-stressed skin construction. They did not fully trust the new methods, so they included both traditional internal structure and modern stressed skin covering. This belt and suspenders approach created an airframe with double the necessary strength and double the necessary weight. Test pilots reported these problems immediately. The production WWII was clearly overweight. Engineers calculated that removing the redundant internal structure would save approximately 1,000 kg. They proposed doing exactly that before full production began. Italian Air Ministry officials rejected the proposal. Redesigning the structure would require new engineering analysis, new testing, and production delays. Officials decided it was better to produce a heavy aircraft immediately than to delay production while making improvements. This decision guaranteed the WWII would fail operationally. After the war, aviation historians and engineers studied these failures to understand how such disasters occurred. The consensus was that inadequate testing, political pressure, and bureaucratic momentum allowed flawed aircraft to enter production. In peacetime, these aircraft would have been canceled after initial test flights revealed their problems. During war, the pressure to produce large quantities of aircraft quickly meant that quality control and thorough testing were sometimes sacrificed. The Buffalo Me-210 and WWII were extreme examples of this phenomenon, but they were not unique. Many other aircraft during World War II suffered from similar, though less severe, problems. The enemy perspective on these aircraft revealed how dramatically inadequate they were. Japanese pilots who encountered Buffaloes at Midway reported that the American fighters posed minimal threat. Lieutenant Yoshio, a Zero pilot who participated in the Midway raid, stated in post-war interviews that shooting down Buffaloes was easier than training Exercises against Japanese aircraft. The Buffaloes were slower, less maneuverable, and could not escape once. A Zero got on their tail. She described engaging a buffalo that tried to dive. Away, he followed easily, closed to less than 100 m and fired a short burst. The buffalo exploded. The entire engagement lasted less than 20 seconds. Japanese pilots at Midway claimed 14 American fighters shot down. They lost 5 Zeros. The disparity was stark. The Japanese considered the engagement a successful fighter sweep with minimal opposition. They were more concerned about American anti-aircraft fire from Midway Island than about the defending fighters. This was the ultimate humiliation for the Buffalo pilots. They were not just outmatched, they were considered negligible threats by enemy pilots who fought them. Japanese after-action. Reports from Midway mentioned the American fighters only briefly, noting that they were inferior aircraft poorly suited for combat against Zeros. The report spent more time discussing American bomber attacks than the fighter opposition. To the Japanese, the Buffaloes at Midway were barely worth mentioning. German pilots had similar assessments of the Me-210, pilots who transitioned from the Bf-110 to the Me-210 requested transfers back to their old aircraft. Major Walter Air Zira, a pilot with combat experience on both the Eastern and Western fronts, flew the Me-210 during evaluation trials. In 1942, he submitted a detailed report stating that the Me-210 was unsuitable for any combat role. Its instability made accurate gunnery impossible. Its unpredictable stall characteristics made defensive maneuvering suicidal. Its weak landing gear made every landing hazardous regardless of combat damage. LA concluded his report by stating that he would rather fly a captured British aircraft than fly the Mi-210 into combat. This was an extraordinary statement from a German officer, effectively saying that enemy aircraft were superior to a new German design. IL's report was not unique. Multiple German pilots submitted similar assessments. The collective pilot opinion was so negative that Luftwaffe leadership could not ignore it. When production was canceled in April 1942, pilots cheered. Several squadron commanders threw parties celebrating the cancellation, an unprecedented reaction to the termination of a new aircraft program. British pilots who encountered the WWII had the opposite experience from Midway. They never saw the Italian aircraft in combat because the WWIIs never made it to the combat zone. Royal Air Force intelligence officers in North Africa initially tracked WWII movements carefully, assuming that modern-looking Italian aircraft posed a significant threat. When reconnaissance flights photographed WWIIs scattered around Italian airfields, British planners allocated resources to bombing those airfields. They did not realize until months later that the WWIIs were empty decoys. British intelligence wasted time and effort tracking aircraft that had been grounded permanently when captured. Italian documents revealed the WWII's true capabilities, after the Italian surrender in 1943. British analysts were astonished. An aircraft that looked modern and had set world speed records was unable to perform basic combat missions. The WWII became a case study in British intelligence training, an example of why visual assessment of enemy equipment could be misleading. An aircraft could look threatening and be completely ineffective. The pilots who flew these pathetic aircraft and survived carried the experience with them for decades. Charles Counds, the Buffalo pilot who ditched at Midway, returned to the United States in 1943 after recovering from injuries sustained in his ditching. He flew training missions for the remainder of the war, but never returned to combat. He left the Marine Corps in 1946 and worked as a commercial airline pilot for 32 years. In interviews decades later, he described flying the Buffalo at Midway as the most terrifying experience of his life, not because of the Japanese, but because he knew his aircraft could not protect him. He stated that modern fighter pilots flying aircraft like the F-14 Tomcat or F-15 Eagle could not comprehend what it felt like to fly in aircraft that was inferior to the enemy in every measurable way. The helplessness stayed with him every time he flew a commercial airliner comfortable and safe. He remembered that morning at Midway when his Buffalo fell apart under Japanese gunfire, and he ditched in the ocean certain he was going to die. He survived because rescue boats reached him within 30 minutes. Dozens of other Buffalo pilots at Midway were not as fortunate. They died in aircraft that should never have been in combat. Marion Carl, who flew a Wildcat at Midway and survived, went on to become a test pilot after the war. He flew experimental aircraft, including early jets and rocket planes. He achieved the rank of Major General in the Marine Corps before retiring in 1973. He stated that even the most dangerous experimental aircraft he flew as a test pilot felt safer than the combat missions at Midway because experimental aircraft had unknown risks while the Buffalo had known inadequacies that could not be overcome. Carl became an advocate for improved pilot equipment and aircraft procurement reform. He testified before Congress multiple times about the importance of fielding competitive equipment. His testimony frequently referenced Midway and the Buffalo, emphasizing that inadequate equipment killed American pilots regardless of their skill or courage. Carl's advocacy contributed to reforms in naval aviation procurement during the 1950s and 60s. He died in 1998 at age 82. German pilots who flew the Me-210 avoided discussing the aircraft in post-war interviews. The subject was embarrassing, a reminder of institutional failure. Oberleutnant Verrer Streib, who evaluated the M210 and declared it unsuitable for combat, went on to become one of Germany's most successful night fighter pilots. He flew Bf-110s and later J-88s, achieving 66 confirmed kills by the end of the war. In post-war interviews, Streib was asked about the Me-210. He responded tersely that it was a failed aircraft that should never have been built and that he preferred not to discuss it further. When pressed, he stated that the Me-210 damaged German pilot morale more than any Allied aircraft because it represented their own sides. Incompetence rather than enemy superiority. Strib died in 2001. His personal papers, donated to a German aviation museum, included a detailed diary from 1942. The diary contained entries about flying the Mi-210. Strib wrote that the aircraft made him question whether Luftwaffe leadership cared about pilot survival, if they could approve an aircraft as dangerous as the Mi-210 for production. What other inadequate equipment might they force pilots to use? This loss of confidence in leadership, Strib wrote, was more damaging than the aircraft itself. Italian pilots who flew the Bar 88 described it as a national humiliation. Captain Carlo Ruspoli, who commanded a squadron equipped with Bar 88s in North Africa, wrote in his memoirs that the aircraft represented everything wrong with Italian military procurement. It looked modern, the propaganda celebrated it, but it could not perform its mission. Ruspoli described the frustration of receiving orders to attack British positions while flying aircraft that could barely take off. He wrote that Italian pilots felt abandoned by their leadership, sent to fight with equipment that guaranteed failure. After the Bar 88s were grounded, Ruspoli's squadron was re-equipped with German Bf 109s. The contrast was stark. The Messerschmitt fighters were older designs, but they were functional. They could take off with full combat loads, maintain formation, reach the combat zone, and engage the enemy. These basic capabilities that should have been minimum requirements were luxuries compared to the Bar 88. Ruspoli survived the war and became a journalist. He spent decades writing about Italian military history and frequently criticized the corruption and incompetence that produced disasters like the Bar 88. He died in 1987. The aircraft that was supposed to demonstrate Italian engineering capability instead proved that Italian industry could not produce competitive combat aircraft. This failure contributed to declining Italian military effectiveness throughout the war and reinforced the perception that Italy was the weakest Axis power. The historical legacy of these pathetic aircraft is complex. They are often omitted from popular histories of World War II, which focus on successful designs like the Spitfire Mustang Zero and Messerschmitt Bf 109. The failures are less celebrated, less documented, and less remembered. But understanding these failures is essential to understanding how air combat evolved during the war. The Buffalo's failure at Midway forced the United States Navy to accelerate deployment of better fighters like the F-6, F Hellcat, and F-4U Corsair. If the Buffalo had been merely adequate, the pressure to develop superior replacements might have been less. In 10. C. The Me-210 disaster forced Messerschmitt to completely redesign their heavy fighter approach, ultimately leading to the Me-410, which, while not perfect, was significantly better. The Bar 88 failure contributed to Italy's decision to acquire German aircraft for their air force, a tacit admission that Italian industry could not produce competitive designs. These aircraft also serve as cautionary examples for modern military procurement. The Addies BT-9AS. The mistakes that produced the Buffalo, Mi-210, and Bar 88 continue to occur in contemporary military programs. Modern weapon systems that suffer cost overruns, performance shortfalls, and operational problems often follow the same pattern established by these World War II failures. The F-35 Lightning II Joint Strike Fighter developed for the United States Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps experienced numerous problems during development, including weight issues, software delays, and performance compromises resulting from trying to create one aircraft that met multiple service requirements. The program was not canceled despite these problems because too much political and financial capital had been invested. This mirrors the Buffalo situation, where known deficiencies were accepted because alternatives were not immediately available. The lesson is clear but apparently difficult to implement. Pressure to deploy new equipment quickly, combined with political and bureaucratic momentum, can override sound engineering judgment. When this happens, the people who pay the price are not the officials who made the decisions, but the soldiers, sailors, and pilots who must use inadequate equipment in combat. At Midway, Major Floyd Parks and 13 other Marine pilots paid that price with their lives. Parks was 34 years old when he died. He left behind a wife and 2 young children. His death was not heroic in the traditional sense. He was not outnumbered or surprised or outmaneuvered by a superior enemy pilot. He was flying an aircraft that could not compete, and when he tried to execute proper defensive tactics, his Buffalo could not respond quickly enough. His aircraft broke apart under stress. Parks fell into the Pacific Ocean and drowned. His body was never recovered. His widow received a telegram informing her that her husband was missing in action. 3 months later, he was declared killed in action. No remains were ever returned to the family. Parks is commemorated on the tablets of the missing at the Honolulu Memorial in Hawaii. His name is carved into stone alongside thousands of other service members lost in the Pacific. Nothing on his memorial indicates that he died flying an inadequate aircraft. The official record states that he was killed in action against Japanese forces. This is technically true but incomplete. He was killed because his government sent him into combat with equipment that was not competitive. The 14 pilots killed at Midway included experienced squadron leaders and brand new pilots fresh from flight school. Some died instantly when their aircraft exploded. Others managed to bail out but drowned in the Pacific before rescue arrived. Many bodies were never recovered. Families received telegrams stating their sons, husbands, and brothers were missing in action. Months later, the status changed to killed in action. No Remains, no closure, just names carved into memorial stones. Second Lieutenant William Brooks survived being shot down in his Buffalo. His aircraft was badly damaged by zero fire during the engagement. The landing gear would not retract. The engine was losing power. Brooks attempted to return to Midway, but realized he could not make it. He ditched in the ocean 4 miles from the island. He got out of the sinking Buffalo and inflated his life vest. He spent 3 hours in the water before a PBY Catalina seaplane landed and picked him up. Brooks suffered from hypothermia and shock. He recovered and returned to duty 6 weeks later, flying Wildcats for the remainder of the war. In post-war interviews, Brooks stated that he was haunted by survivor guilt. He had lived while better pilots died. The only difference, he believed, was luck in where the Zeros focused their attacks. Dozens of German pilots died flying the Me-210 during training accidents that should never have happened. Landing gear collapses killed pilots when wheels folded on touchdown. Aircraft skidded off runways and caught fire. Pilots were trapped in cockpits and died before rescuers could extract them. Accident investigations consistently concluded that landing gear failed due to structural weakness, a known problem. With the Me-210, veteran pilots with hundreds of flight hours could not prevent accidents caused by inadequate equipment. Their deaths were listed as training accidents, not combat losses, so they do not appear in statistics of Luftwaffe combat casualties. They are buried in military cemeteries across Germany. Their gravestones indicate they died in service, but do not mention circumstances. Italian pilots in North Africa flew missions in WWIIs that could barely get airborne, risking their lives in aircraft that posed more danger than the enemy. Multiple Italian pilots died attempting to take off in WWIIs carrying full bomb loads. The aircraft would accelerate down runways, reach takeoff speed, lift off momentarily, then settle back down with insufficient airspeed to maintain flight. Landing gear would collapse, aircraft would slide off runways into soft sand and flip over. Pilots would be crushed when canopies collapsed. The official cause of death was always listed as an accident during takeoff. The actual cause was that the WWII was incapable of taking off with a full combat load in North African heat. Every pilot knew this. Every squadron commander knew this. Orders demanded that missions be flown anyway. Refusing orders meant court-martial. Pilots died because their aircraft failed them. These pilots deserve to be remembered not as failures, but as victims of institutional failures beyond their control. They demonstrated courage by flying aircraft they knew were inadequate. They followed orders and executed their missions despite understanding the odds were against them. Second Lieutenant Charles Kuhn climbed into his Buffalo on the morning of June 4, 1942, knowing that his aircraft was called the Flying Coffin, knowing that Buffalo in Asia had been massacred by Japanese fighters, knowing that he might not survive the next hour. He flew anyway. That took courage that transcended the aircraft's capabilities. When his Buffalo was shot down and he ditched in the ocean, he survived through skill and luck. He managed to keep the crippled aircraft level long enough to gain air. Speed for ditching. He executed a controlled water landing despite having a shattered instrument panel and a seized engine. He got out of the sinking aircraft and swam until rescue boats reached him. His survival was not because the Buffalo was adequate. It was because he was a skilled pilot who refused to give up despite flying in aircraft that failed him. The Brewster Buffalo Messed Me 210 and Breda Bar 88. Lints represent the worst fighter aircraft of World War II, not because they were the slowest or the poorest armed, but because they failed to do the job they were designed to do. They could not compete with enemy aircraft. They endangered their own pilots. They wasted resources that could have been used on better designs. They represented institutional failures that cost lives and damaged morale. In the history of military aviation, these aircraft stand as examples of how not to develop combat aircraft. Their failures taught lessons that influenced aircraft design for decades afterward. Those lessons came at a terrible cost, paid by pilots who deserved better equipment than what they were given. The men who flew these pathetic aircraft into combat demonstrated courage that their aircraft could never match. They fought with inadequate tools, and many of them died because those tools failed them. Their sacrifice should not be forgotten. Their stories matter because they remind us that equipment quality directly impacts survival in combat, and that institutional decisions made far from the battlefield have life or death consequences for the people who must execute those decisions. Major Floyd Parks, Second Lieutenant Charles Counds, Oberleutnant Verrer Streibe, and the countless other pilots who flew inadequate aircraft during World War II deserve recognition not for the aircraft they flew, but for their willingness to fly them despite understanding the risks. These aircraft were pathetic. The pilots who flew them were